In the mid-20th century, when Indonesia gained its independence from the Dutch, the new regime found itself governing a vast majority Muslim population. And under pressure from the very well-organized political Islamic establishment, the new government only recognized as official those religions that were monotheistic. Okay, if you were not monotheistic, if you did not belong to one of these monotheistic faith systems, you were deemed a person without religion, okay, and thus a legitimate target of conversion attempts. And there were systematic conversion campaigns launched against places like, Bali, for example, which was mostly Hindu. So if you were Hindu or belonged to one of these non-monotheistic faith systems, you were essentially a second-class citizen. You did not enjoy the full benefits of citizenship. Now maybe it's fitting that as I record this, the Muslim call to prayer begins. Here I am walking in ancient, or at least early medieval, Hindu temple ruins, the largest temple in Southeast Asia, and you can hear the Muslim call to prayer because it's surrounded by mosques. For 1,000, maybe 1,500 years, it was Hinduism as well as Buddhism that was the dominant faith system here in the Indonesian archipelago. There were Hindu kingdoms and there were Buddhist kingdoms. 1,000 years before the first Muslim Sultanate in Indonesia. That Hinduism and the Buddhism would have come probably from South India, traders from South India that plied these seas. Missionaries as well, priests, monks, and whatnot, but traders predominantly is the thinking these days. That's how these faith systems and their ideas came to predominate and culturally dominate Indonesia, the Indonesian archipelago. And there would have been Hindu kingdoms and Buddhist kingdoms, Hindu courts and Buddhist courts patronizing Hindu and Buddhist art, familiar with the Mahabharata, performing the Ramayana, familiar with people like Arjuna, Vishnu, Shiva, Ganesha, the Buddha. This was the dominant culture. We have records from Chinese pilgrims. They're traveling from China to India, looking for texts that they can then bring back to China, and they'd pass through here, and often they'd stop here for months or even years to do what? To learn Indian language, to be able to go grab these texts, know how to speak and to read them, and then come back, and they'd stop here often on their way back as well to do translation. So this speaks to Indonesia's place in the South Indian cultural milieu. These Chinese travelers speak of vibrant, wealthy, prosperous Hindu and Buddhist kingdoms here. For many years, Hinduism and Buddhism coexisted in the Indonesian archipelago. Now, there were Hindu kingdoms and Buddhist kingdoms that competed with each other, and sometimes Hinduism was adopted by a royal court because its competitor was Buddhist, or vice versa. But often the two faith systems would actually fuse together, and this happened in South Asia and throughout Southeast Asia as well. There was a fusion, a new religious synthesis between Hinduism and Buddhism, as well as the local animism, some other isms. And so that's sort of an interesting phenomenon. One encapsulation of that phenomenon, for example, would be King Kittanagara, who was the fifth and last most ambitious king of Singhasari. He fused within himself, and of course he's doing this for legitimacy's sake, for the sake of consolidation of power, gain the loyalty of his people, whatnot, unity, who knows. But certainly for legitimacy's sake, he fuses within himself both the Hindu and Buddhist tradition. He made himself the incarnation, or presented himself as the incarnation of Shiva, the Hindu god of transformation and destruction, as well as an incarnation of the Buddha himself. In the 1300s, Hinduism and Buddhism dominated culturally and politically here in the Indonesian archipelago, including within the largest maritime state of them all, that of Majapahit. But it wasn't to last. See, this also happened to be the same time that the first Islamic sultanates were being established in the Indonesian archipelago in the far northwest of Sumatra. These sultanates began to proliferate, began to compete with each other. Islam made steady gains over the next couple centuries, and those Hindu and Buddhist kingdoms caught in the middle. What was often a military competition between the sultanates were one by one swallowed up. Their citizens left to pay the jizya tax, on, the tax on non-believers. We may assume that many of them converted to Islam in order to escape this tax. Others found refuge on islands. They'd run away if they didn't want to convert, and they'd find refuge on islands where they found strength in numbers, islands they could defend. So when the Portuguese showed up in the late 1400s, this amazing cultural transition was already well underway. By the time the Dutch showed up in 1600, these islands were dominated by Islam for the most part. And by 1800, much of the Buddhist and Hindu history that we've been discussing had been all but forgotten. Its monumental architecture in ruins in the jungle. Now, this history was rediscovered, ironically, by foreigners, by foreign outsiders, in the form of the colonial Dutch. It was the Dutch who rediscovered places like Borova Door and began studying them and researching their history and restoring them. Borova Door is a gigantic stupa made up of scores of other stupas, the largest Buddhist structure in the world. From the air, a perfect mandala. It's an incredible structure built in the 700s and 800s, and its restoration began under the Dutch. Same with Prambanan, the great Hindu temple, largest Hindu temple in Southeast Asia. Its restoration began under the Dutch. Even after independence, the Balinese government, which of course, as I mentioned, was under threat from the Indonesian government, turned to help not just to India, but also, ironically, to the old colonial Dutch, their old overlords. Well, eventually, using a sort of play on words with ancient Hindu scripture, Indonesian Hindus were able to sort of portray themselves as monotheists, and therefore join their co-citizens who were monotheists, the vast majority of their co-citizens who were also monotheist. Hinduism was able to gain recognition as one of the 5 official religions, state religions of Indonesia. Why do we even need state religions? But that's a whole nother discussion. Anyway, almost immediately, hundreds of thousands of Indonesian Hindus came out of the religious closet, so to speak, revealing themselves as Hindus in Hindu enclaves all over Indonesia. Today, somewhere between 4 million and 11 million Indonesians profess the Hindu faith.